The wagon creaked like an old wound reopening as it rolled through the red Georgia clay. Each turn of the wheel dug deeper into the soil, leaving behind a scar that would fade by morning, but the arrival it carried would not fade so easily. But wait for a second before we continue towards the video. Let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe. The plantation of Hawthorne Ridge sat high on a gentle rise, surrounded by cotton fields that stretched like pale ghosts under the afternoon sun. White columns held up the main house, proud and unyielding, as if daring the land itself to challenge its authority. Live oaks framed the property, their branches heavy with Spanish moss, swaying slowly as though whispering secrets only the earth could hear. From the front porch, Colonel Thomas Hawthorne watched the wagon approach. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, his gray-streaked hair pulled neatly back. He had owned this land for nearly 20 years, and in that time he believed he had learned everything there was to know about people, how to break them, how to bend them, and how to keep them useful. Yet something about this delivery unsettled him. The trader had been vague, too vague. A troublesome one, the man had said, eyes darting as though the woman might leap from the shadows and strangle him. Smart, too smart. Best keep her busy, best keep her watched. Colonel Hawthorne did not like warnings that came without explanations. The wagon slowed to a stop at the edge of the yard. Dust settled, horses snorted. The driver jumped down and tipped his hat, but Hawthorne barely acknowledged him. His eyes were fixed on the figure seated at the back. She did not move. Most new slaves arrived terrified, crying, shaking, pleading. Others arrived defiant, spitting curses, their hatred loud and careless. This woman did neither. She sat perfectly still, hands resting in her lap, ankles crossed beneath a coarse grey dress. Her head was bowed, dark hair pulled back simply, no ornament, no attempt to draw attention. Chains circled her wrists, but loosely, an unusual mercy. "Stand her up," Hawthorne ordered. The driver hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Sir, she'll stand on her own." That was the second warning. Before Hawthorne could repeat himself, the woman lifted her head. Her eyes were the first thing anyone noticed, not because they were bright or soft, but because they were measuring. They moved slowly, deliberately, taking in the house, the trees, the men, the distance to the fields. She saw everything. She rose without help, stepping down from the wagon with careful balance, as though the ground itself might betray her. When she stood before Hawthorne, she did not lower her gaze immediately. It was a small thing. It felt enormous. "Name?" Hawthorne asked sharply. A pause, just long enough to be unsettling. "Eliza," she said. Her voice was calm, not submissive, not defiant, simply steady. Hawthorne frowned. "Eliza what?" Another pause. "Eliza is enough." A murmur rippled among the overseers. Hawthorne felt heat rise behind his eyes. "You will answer properly when spoken to," he snapped. She lowered her gaze then, but not in fear. In calculation. "Yes, sir." Something about the way she said it made the word "sir" sound hollow. Inside the house, Margaret Hawthorne stood at the parlor window watching the scene unfold. She had been mistress of Hawthorne Ridge since she was 19, trained to manage servants, entertain guests, and maintain appearances. She prided herself on order, and she hated surprises. "Who is she?" she asked, her fingers tightening around the curtain. Their eldest son, Nathaniel, leaned against the doorway. At 23, he carried his father's confidence, but none of his restraint. His eyes followed Eliza with open interest. "New purchase, I suppose," he said lightly. "She doesn't look like much." Margaret said nothing. She had learned long ago that instincts were more reliable than reassurances. The moment Eliza was brought inside to be inspected, the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though the house itself recognized an intruder. Margaret circled her slowly, assessing posture, skin, scars. Eliza stood motionless, eyes lowered again, breathing slow and controlled. "How old are you?" Margaret asked. "Eliza does not know," she replied, a lie. Margaret knew it instantly. "Where are you from?" "South Carolina." Another half-truth. Margaret stopped in front of her. "You will work in the house, cooking, cleaning. You will obey without question. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Too flawless. Nathaniel stepped closer. "She speaks well." "So did the devil," Margaret replied coldly. Nathaniel laughed, but uneasily. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the enslaved quarters buzzed with whispers. "A new one," someone said. "They say she don't cry. They say she watched the trader die. No one like that comes without trouble. Eliza sat alone on the edge of a narrow cot, listening. She did not speak. She did not ask questions. She learned. The rhythms of the plantation revealed themselves quickly, the changing of shifts, the personalities of overseers, the invisible hierarchies among the enslaved. Who had power? Who pretended not to? Who broke easily? By nightfall, she knew where the knives were kept in the kitchen, which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck, and which faces looked away when cruelty passed by. She also knew something else. This house was already fractured. Margaret Hawthorne slept beside her husband, but trusted him no more than she trusted the mirrors that reflected her aging face. Nathaniel resented his father's authority and his mother's control. The younger children sensed tension without understanding it, like animals before a storm. Eliza did not create cracks. She found them. Her first night passed without incident. That alone unsettled the household. By the second day, Margaret noticed small disruptions. A misplaced letter, a conversation remembered differently by two people who should have agreed, a look exchanged at the wrong moment, nothing obvious, nothing provable. Yet by the end of the week, Margaret felt as though she was standing on shifting ground. Nathaniel lingered too long in the kitchen. The cook grew defensive without cause. The overseer reported a dispute that no one else remembered clearly, and always Eliza was present, but never responsible. She moved like a shadow, efficient and quiet. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was only truth, or something that wore truth's face convincingly enough to pass. One evening, as Margaret watched her set the table, she felt an unfamiliar chill. "Look at me," Margaret said suddenly. Eliza obeyed. For a brief, dangerous moment, their eyes met. Margaret saw no hatred there, only patience. That frightened her more than hatred ever could. Colonel Hawthorne dismissed his unease as weakness. He believed power was simple, force applied consistently. He believed fear solved all problems. But as he watched Eliza cross the yard at dusk, he could not shake the sense that something had already begun, something beyond his control. In the distance, thunder rolled. The storm had not yet arrived, but it was coming, and when it did, Hawthorne Ridge would never be the same again. The first thing Eliza learned at Hawthorne Ridge was that silence made people careless. People feared loud rebellion. They watched for raised voices, clenched fists, open defiance. Silence, however, slipped past their guard. Silence invited confession. Silence made men talk and women reveal themselves without knowing they had done so. By the third morning, Eliza understood the plantation better than most who had lived there for years. She rose before dawn, moving tea. Groove the servant corridors with soft, measured steps. The house at that hour felt different. Less proud, more vulnerable. Floorboards groaned like tired bones, and the walls seemed thinner, as though secrets pressed against them, desperate to escape. In the kitchen, she worked beside Hannah, the head cook, a woman with tired eyes and hands roughened by decades of fire and flour. Hannah did not trust easily. She had survived too long for that.
"You best keep your eyes down,"
Hannah muttered as they kneaded dough. "This house eats people alive." Eliza nodded. "Yes, ma'am." But her eyes did not stay down. She watched how Hannah stiffened when footsteps approached the kitchen door. She noticed how Hannah flinched not at Colonel Hawthorne's voice, but at the sound of Margaret Hawthorne's silk skirts brushing against the floor. Fear came in many shapes. Margaret preferred order to cruelty. Colonel Hawthorne preferred cruelty to effort. Eliza stored that away. By mid-morning, the house filled with noise. Children's footsteps echoed down the halls. Nathaniel's laughter carried from the study, too loud, too careless. Margaret's voice floated sharply from room to room, correcting servants, adjusting flowers, rearranging objects that did not need rearranging. Control was Margaret's armor. Eliza passed Nathaniel in the hallway, carrying a tray of linens. He slowed, offering a lazy smile. "You're quiet," he said. "Most new ones are not." Eliza stopped, lowered her eyes respectfully. "Eliza listens more than she speaks, sir." Nathaniel chuckled. "That's wise. You'll last longer." She did not respond. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You ever work in a house like this before?" "Yes, sir." Another half-truth. He studied her face, as though searching for something familiar. "You don't look afraid." At that, Eliza finally looked up. "I am careful," she said. Nathaniel straightened, suddenly uneasy. "Go on," he muttered. As she walked away, Eliza felt his gaze linger. Curiosity, not desire, yet. Curiosity was always the beginning. The first crack appeared that afternoon. Margaret Hawthorne discovered a letter missing from her writing desk. It was not an important letter. That was the problem. Important letters were locked away, guarded. This one had been personal, never meant for anyone else's eyes. She searched the desk again, fingers trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. Nothing. "Someone's been in here," she said sharply to Clara, one of the housemaids. Clara's eyes widened. "No, ma'am, I swear." Margaret stared at her, suspicion rising like bile. "Then explain how my things have been disturbed." "I don't know, ma'am." Margaret dismissed her with a wave, but the damage was done. Trust, once fractured, never returned whole. That evening, Margaret mentioned the letter casually to her husband. "Probably misplaced," Colonel Hawthorne said, pouring himself a drink. "I do not misplace things," Margaret replied coldly. Colonel Hawthorne sighed. "You're seeing trouble where there is none." Eliza served dinner quietly, her presence barely acknowledged. Yet she noticed the way Margaret's hands shook as she folded her napkin. She noticed how Nathaniel avoided his mother's gaze. She noticed everything. The enslaved quarters told a different story. Whispers spread quickly. "The mistress is angry again. They say she thinks someone's spying. They say the new one been in the house too much." Eliza heard it all and said nothing. At night she lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling above her cot. Sleep came lightly, always ready to flee. Her mind replayed old lessons learned through pain. Lessons about timing, about patience, about never striking too soon. Revenge, she knew, was a slow craft. By the fifth day the household felt strained. Margaret corrected servants more harshly. Nathaniel grew restless, riding out into the fields for hours at a time. Colonel Hawthorne drank more in the evenings, his temper shortening with every glass. The tension had a taste, sharp, metallic. Eliza became a constant presence, assigned to assist Margaret directly. She brushed dresses, arranged jewelry, stood silently during fittings. "You've been in fine houses before," Margaret observed one morning. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret turned, studying her reflection in the mirror, and Eliza's behind her. "Do you know why women fail in houses like this?" Margaret asked. Eliza remained silent. "Because they forget their place," Margaret continued. "They imagine themselves clever, special." Eliza met her gaze in the mirror. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned away, unsettled, without knowing why. That afternoon Nathaniel returned from the fields furious. His horse had thrown a shoe. The stable boy claimed he had warned Nathaniel earlier. Nathaniel swore he had heard no such thing. Voices rose. Accusations followed. Colonel Hawthorne punished the boy swiftly without investigation. Later, Nathaniel complained to Eliza as she cleaned mud from his boots. "They lie to protect themselves," he said bitterly. "All of them." Eliza paused just long enough to appear thoughtful. "Sometimes people lie because they are afraid, sir." Nathaniel scoffed. "Afraid of what?" She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Being blamed for something they did not do." Nathaniel frowned. "Are you saying the boy told the truth?" "I am saying fear makes people speak strangely." Nathaniel waved her off, irritated, but the seed had been planted. That night he lay awake, replaying the argument. Doubt gnawed at him. Small things began to go wrong. A cup shattered where it should not have slipped. A message delivered late. A conversation overheard and misunderstood. Each incident alone meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern. Margaret accused Clara of negligence. Clara wept and denied it. Hannah defended her. Margaret snapped that loyalty made servants blind. Colonel Hawthorne barked orders to restore discipline. Discipline, however, did not restore trust. Eliza watched the family unravel from the inside, her role invisible, her hands clean. One evening, Margaret entered her bedroom to find the missing letter placed neatly atop her desk. No explanation, no note, just returned. Margaret stared at it for a long time. "Who did this?" she whispered. Fear crept into her voice, not fear of punishment, but fear of being known. She did not mention it to anyone. That silence was Eliza's victory. In the quarters, an older enslaved man named Isaac approached Eliza quietly. "You walk dangerous paths," he said. Eliza met his gaze. "I walk careful ones. This house is watching you." Eliza tilted her head. "They watch many things. They see little." Isaac shook his head. "Smart ones don't last." Eliza's voice softened. "Neither do obedient ones." Isaac had no answer for that. By the end of the second week, Hawthorne Ridge felt like a house holding its breath. Margaret dreamed of whispers behind doors. Nathaniel drank alone more often. Colonel Hawthorne's patience thinned to nothing. And Eliza? Eliza learned their schedules, their weaknesses, their fears. She learned who listened and who dismissed warnings. She learned how easily truth bent when wrapped in the right tone. Most importantly, she learned this. The Hawthornes believed themselves masters of others. They had never learned to master themselves. One night, as Eliza stood outside the house, looking up at the darkened windows, thunder rumbled again in the distance. The storm was closer now, and Hawthorne Ridge would be the first to feel its rain. By the time the first true crack appeared, Hawthorne Ridge was already hollow beneath its polished surface. What broke was not wood or stone, but something far more fragile. Certainty. Colonel Thomas Hawthorne had always believed certainty was his birthright, certainty that he was respected, certainty that his household obeyed him, certainty that fear, properly applied, could correct any flaw. But certainty, Eliza understood, was a brittle thing. It shattered when questioned too often. The morning began like any other, with mist rolling low over the cotton fields and the sound of the breakfast bell echoing through the yard. Yet even before the sun fully rose, tension lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Margaret Hawthorne woke with a headache and a sense of being watched. She sat up slowly, pressing her palm to her temple, listening. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even the servant's footsteps seemed muffled. Careful, she rang the bell sharply. Eliza appeared within moments, as though she had been waiting just beyond the door. "You rang, ma'am?" Margaret studied her closely. The girl's posture was perfect. Her eyes were lowered just enough to seem obedient, yet not so much as to appear fearful. "Did you enter this room last night?" Margaret asked suddenly. Eliza paused, only a breath. "No, ma'am." Margaret searched her face for guilt and found none. That somehow unsettled her more than denial ever could. "Very well," Margaret said, waving her away. "Fetch my dress, the blue one." "Yes, ma'am." As Eliza crossed the room, Margaret's gaze followed her, sharp and suspicious. She could not explain it, but the feeling gnawed at her, that the girl knew things she should not know. Downstairs, Nathaniel Hawthorne paced the dining room, irritation etched into every movement. He had slept poorly, haunted by half-remembered arguments and doubts he could not silence. When his father entered, Nathaniel straightened instinctively. "You're late," Colonel Hawthorne said curtly. "I was riding early," Nathaniel replied. Colonel Hawthorne snorted. "You ride to escape responsibility." Nathaniel clenched his jaw. "I manage the fields as you taught me." "You manage nothing," his father snapped. "You question my decisions. That stable boy should have been punished sooner." Nathaniel hesitated. That hesitation was all it took. Colonel Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "You think I was wrong?" "I think," Nathaniel said carefully, "that we may have acted too quickly." Silence fell heavy between them. Margaret entered then, her presence sharpening the moment. "What is this about?" "Your son doubts my authority," Colonel Hawthorne said bitterly. Margaret turned to Nathaniel. "Is that true?" Nathaniel looked between them, trapped. "I only meant—" "You meant to undermine me," his father interrupted. "In my own house." Eliza entered quietly, setting breakfast dishes on the table, her movements slow, deliberate. She did not look at any of them, yet she felt the tension thrumming like a living thing. Margaret noticed her and snapped, "Leave us." Eliza withdrew without a word, but she heard everything. The argument did not resolve. It merely sank beneath the surface, poisoning what it touched. Later that day, Margaret summoned Hannah to the parlor. "I want to know who has been talking," Margaret said sharply. Hannah stiffened. "Talking, ma'am? About me, about this house?" Hannah's voice trembled despite her effort to remain calm. "I don't know anything, ma'am." Margaret circled her like a hawk. "Lies travel fast among servants. Someone hears something. Someone always hears something." Hannah swallowed. "We hear what we are told, ma'am." Margaret leaned closer. "And what have you been told?" Hannah's eyes flickered just once toward the door. Margaret followed the glance. Eliza stood there, holding folded linens. Margaret's lips tightened. "You may go," she said to Hannah, dismissing her abruptly. When they were alone, Margaret studied Eliza again. "You spend much time listening," Margaret said. "Yes, ma'am." "To whom?" "To whoever speaks, ma'am." Margaret's voice dropped. "Be careful what you remember." Eliza met her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." That night, Margaret dreamed of doors opening on their own. True fracture came 2 days later. Colonel Hawthorne received a letter. It arrived unsealed, delivered by a neighboring planter's boy. Colonel Hawthorne frowned as he read it, his face darkening. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "A lie," he said, "or an insult." He thrust the letter at her. It accused him subtly, politely, of mismanaging his labor force, of allowing unrest, of letting his household become disorderly. Margaret read it twice, her pulse quickening. Who would write such a thing? "Someone who thinks I am weak," Colonel Hawthorne growled. Nathaniel, standing nearby, shifted uneasily. "Father, perhaps they misunderstand." "Misunderstand?" Colonel Hawthorne slammed his fist against the desk. "Word does not travel unless someone spreads it." His gaze moved slowly to Margaret. She stiffened. "Are you accusing me?" "Someone talks," he said. "Someone in this house." Margaret's cheeks flushed. "I would never humiliate you." "Then who?" he demanded. Silence answered him. Eliza, dusting nearby shelves, felt the moment tighten like a noose. That night Colonel Hawthorne ordered harsher discipline across the plantation. Fear was his answer to doubt. The consequences were immediate. The enslaved quarters grew quieter, eyes lowered more deeply, voices stifled. But fear did not restore order. It sharpened resentment. Isaac warned Eliza again. "You stir storms you cannot stop." Eliza replied softly, "Storms were coming long before me." Margaret's patience fractured next. She confronted Clara over a broken vase, an heirloom Margaret cherished. "You did this," Margaret said coldly. Clara shook her head frantically. "I swear I did not touch it." "Liar," Margaret snapped. Eliza stood nearby, silent. Margaret turned to her. "You were here earlier." "Yes, ma'am. Did you see Clara mishandle anything?" Eliza hesitated. "Just long enough. I saw her dusting the shelf," Eliza said carefully. "Perhaps it slipped." Clara stared at Eliza in disbelief. "You know I didn't—" "Enough," Margaret said. "You will be punished." Clara was dragged away sobbing. Eliza did not watch. But that night, Clara whispered through tears, "Why did you let them think it was me?" Eliza's voice was quiet. "Because they were already thinking it." Clara did not understand. The house did. Nathaniel began to avoid the parlor, the study, his father's gaze. He spent more time riding, drinking, brooding. One evening he found Eliza alone in the kitchen, staring into the fire. "You see things," he said abruptly. Eliza did not turn. "Everyone sees things, sir." "You see more," he insisted. She met his eyes. "Seeing does not mean speaking." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Do you think my father is losing control?" The question hung between them like a blade. Eliza answered truthfully, just not completely. "I think fear makes men loud." Nathaniel laughed bitterly. "That it does." From that moment he trusted her. Trust was the most dangerous weapon of all. The final crack split the Hawthorne household in public. During a dinner with guests, Colonel Hawthorne lost his temper with a servant over a spilled glass. Margaret flinched. Nathaniel rose halfway from his seat. "Father, please." Colonel Hawthorne turned on him. "Sit down." Nathaniel did not. The room fell silent. "You shame us," Nathaniel said, voice tight. "All of us." Colonel Hawthorne stared at his son as though seeing a stranger. "Get out," he said quietly. Nathaniel left the table. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Margaret said nothing, but her silence was louder than any argument. Eliza watched from the shadows, heart steady, mind sharp. The first house had cracked, not because she struck it, but because she knew exactly where to press. That night, thunder broke directly overhead. The storm had arrived, and Hawthorne Ridge would never again be whole. Reputations are not made in moments of fire. They are born in ash, quietly, AF. Till everything is already burned. By the time Hawthorne Ridge realized it could no longer contain its own decay, the name Eliza had already begun to travel beyond its gates. It traveled the way dangerous things always do, disguised as gossip. The storm that shattered the Hawthorne household did not end with thunder. It lingered. Nathaniel Hawthorne did not return to the dinner table that night. He did not apologize. He did not explain himself. He rode out into the darkness, spurring his horse hard enough to draw blood from its sides, as if pain, any pain, might drown out the humiliation still ringing in his ears. Margaret watched him leave from the upper window, her hands clenched so tightly her nails cut into her palms. "This is your doing," she said later that night, her voice cold as she faced her husband. Colonel Hawthorne poured himself another drink. "You raised him." "I tried to protect him," she snapped, "from your temper, from your cruelty." "My cruelty built this house," he roared, "and now it is tearing it apart." They stared at each other across the bedroom, two strangers bound by pride and resentment rather than love. Neither noticed Eliza standing silently in the hallway, holding a basin of water, listening. She did not smile, she did not gloat, she simply remembered. The next morning, Colonel Hawthorne made a decision. Fear had not restored his authority, violence had not silenced dissent, so he chose removal. "Eliza will be sold," he announced flatly at breakfast. Margaret's head snapped up. "Why?" "Because disorder follows her," he replied. "I won't have my household poisoned by one girl." Margaret studied him closely. She suspected this was not entirely about Eliza. It was about blame, about restoring control without admitting fault. Nathaniel said nothing. Eliza stood at the edge of the room, eyes lowered. "Yes, sir," she said. Her voice did not tremble. That disturbed Margaret more than defiance ever could. The trader arrived 3 days later. He was a different man from the one who had delivered Eliza to Hawthorne Ridge, older, sharper-eyed, his smile worn thin by experience. He circled Eliza slowly, inspecting her hands, her posture, her face. "She looks calm," he said, "too calm." Colonel Hawthorne's jaw tightened. "She's trouble." The trader chuckled. "They all are, in one way or another." Colonel Hawthorne lowered his voice. "She causes unrest, turns people against each other." The trader's smile faded. "You should have said that sooner." "It's too late?" Hawthorne asked. The trader hesitated. "No, but I won't place her just anywhere." Margaret watched from the porch as Eliza was led back toward the wagon. For a moment, just one, Eliza lifted her eyes. They met Margaret's. Margaret felt a chill run through her, sudden and deep, like stepping into cold water. It was not hatred she saw, it was understanding, and that frightened her more than anything else. The wagon rolled away from Hawthorne Ridge under a pale sky. Behind it, the plantation breathed like a wounded animal, alive but changed forever. Ahead lay uncertainty. Eliza sat silently, chains loose again, eyes forward. She did not look back. Her next destination was Bellamy Plantation, 2 counties south, a smaller estate, but one that prided itself on refinement and restraint. Its owner, Edmund Bellamy, believed himself a more enlightened man than Colonel Hawthorne. "I run a quiet house," he told the trader, "order without chaos." The trader nodded, though uneasily. "She requires attention." Bellamy waved him off. "I've managed far worse." Eliza listened. Men always believed they were different. Bellamy Plantation felt different the moment Eliza arrived. The air was calmer. The servants quieter, more cautious than fearful. The mistress of the house, Lydia Bellamy, was pale and soft-spoken, her authority subtle rather than sharp. "Put her in the house," Lydia said after a brief inspection. "She looks capable." Edmund hesitated. The trader warned. "Warnings are exaggerations," Lydia replied gently. "Fear makes men imaginative." Eliza lowered her head. Yes, fear did. At first Eliza changed nothing. She worked efficiently, quietly. She spoke little. She listened constantly. Bellamy Plantation had its own fractures, different from Hawthorne Ridge, but no less fragile. Edmund Bellamy was respected, but not loved. His authority relied on appearing reasonable rather than being strong. Lydia, though kind, was deeply insecure, constantly afraid of displeasing her husband. Their eldest daughter, Rose, resented both of them. Eliza learned this within a week. She learned that Edmund hated confrontation, that Lydia avoided conflict at any cost, that Rose craved attention and validation she never received, and she learned something else. The overseer, Caleb Wright, liked to talk. Caleb spoke freely around Eliza, mistaking her silence for ignorance. "Master Bellamy's too soft," he muttered one afternoon. "Let's the house run him." Eliza nodded. "Yes, sir." "Wouldn't last a day on a place like Hawthorne Ridge," he continued. Eliza paused. "Hawthorne Ridge?" she asked softly. Caleb glanced at her, surprised. "You from there?" "Yes, sir." Caleb whistled. "That place is a mess. Heard the son nearly came to blows with his own father. Heard servants running wild." Eliza said nothing, but that night Lydia Bellamy heard something different. She overheard Caleb speaking to Edmund in low tones. "They say the trouble started with a girl they brought in," Caleb said. "Smart one, quiet, turned them against each other." Lydia's breath caught. Her gaze drifted involuntarily toward the hallway, toward Eliza's quarters. From that moment, the house began to change. Lydia watched Eliza more closely. Edmund questioned servants more often. Caleb's tone sharpened, but suspicion did not bring unity. It brought tension. Rose Bellamy noticed first. "Why does everyone look afraid?" she asked Eliza one afternoon as they folded laundry. Eliza considered her carefully. Fear spreads easily, she said. Fear of what? Eliza met her eyes. Of being seen. Rose swallowed. Whispers began. She's the one from Hawthorne Ridge. They say she ruined them. They say she listens too much. Eliza heard her name spoken cautiously, sometimes not at all, replaced with that one or the quiet girl. Reputation had begun its work, not because Eliza claimed power, but because others feared it. The first public incident at Bellamy Plantation was small, a disagreement over ledgers. Edmund accused Caleb of miscounting supplies. Caleb accused Lydia of giving conflicting instructions. Lydia denied both claims. Each remembered the conversation differently. Each blamed the other. Eliza was not mentioned. She was not needed. The second incident was louder. Rose accused her mother of spying on her letters. Lydia denied it. Edmund took Lydia's side without listening. Rose fled the house in tears. That night Lydia confronted Edmund in private. "You never believe me," she whispered. Edmund rubbed his temples. "I cannot manage everyone's emotions." Silence fell between them. Eliza passed quietly in the corridor. Within a month, Bellamy Plantation felt uneasy, not broken yet, but alert, cautious. Edmund Bellamy sent a letter to a neighboring planter, asking discreetly about Hawthorne Ridge. The reply came days later. "Something was wrong there," it read. "I can't say what, only that the house ate itself alive." Edmund folded the letter slowly. His gaze lifted, straight to Eliza. She stood in the doorway, waiting for instructions. For the first time since her arrival, Edmund felt afraid of her, not because she had threatened him, but because he could not prove she hadn't. That night he told Lydia, "If this house falls apart, I will not let it be said I ignored the signs." "What signs?" Lydia whispered. "Edmund D." I did not answer. The rumor spread beyond Bellamy Plantation. Planters spoke in low voices at church gatherings. Traders began asking questions. "Have you heard of the girl, the one who ruins houses? They say she never lifts a hand. They say she doesn't need to." By the time Eliza was sold again, quietly, discreetly, her reputation preceded her, not as a rebel, not as a criminal, but as something far more dangerous, a presence, a whisper, a warning. And wherever she went next, families would already be afraid. Before she ever spoke a word, by the time Eliza left Bellamy Plantation, fear had learned her name. It was no longer spoken carelessly. It was lowered into conversations like a blade slid quietly between ribs, slow, deliberate, and meant to be felt only after it was too late. Bellamy Plantation did not collapse all at once. That would have been merciful. Instead, it unraveled thread by thread, each failure blamed on another, until no one remembered where the first tear had begun. And that, more than destruction, was Eliza's true craft, the fall of the second house. Edmund Bellamy began keeping his ledgers locked. That was the first sign. Lydia noticed it immediately. Her husband had always trusted her with household accounts, believing gentleness and cooperation kept peace better than suspicion. When he started slipping the ledger into his desk drawer and locking it before bed, Lydia felt something shift beneath her feet. "You don't trust me anymore," she said one night, trying to keep her voice calm. Edmund did not look at her. "I trust facts." "And I am not one of them," she whispered. Silence answered her. Eliza stood outside the bedroom door, holding fresh linens, listening to Lydia's breath break into quiet sobs. The next morning, Lydia's eyes were red. Edmund noticed and misread it as guilt. Caleb Wright, sensing the change in the air, grew bolder. He spoke more freely, contradicted Lydia openly, reminded Edmund of appearances. "You don't want folk thinking your wife runs the place," he said once, half joking. Edmund laughed weakly. Eliza noted that too. The plantation began to divide itself. Servants chose sides without knowing why. Some followed Lydia, loyal to her kindness. Others aligned with Caleb, sensing his rising influence. Edmund stood between them, paralyzed by the very reason he believed himself superior, his refusal to confront conflict directly. Eliza became invisible again. That invisibility was her shield. She passed messages faithfully but always precisely as spoken, never softened, never clarified. Small misunderstandings hardened into resentments. Lydia asked for supplies. Edmund heard demands. Edmund questioned expenses. Lydia heard accusations. Caleb offered explanations. Edmund heard confirmation of his doubts. One afternoon, Lydia discovered that a crate of linens had gone missing. "I never ordered them moved," she insisted. Caleb shrugged. "Master Bellamy told me to." Edmund denied it. Voices rose. Eliza stood nearby, eyes lowered, hands folded. "Someone is lying," Edmund snapped. Lydia's voice shook. "I am not." Caleb crossed his arms. "Then who is?" Silence fell. Everyone looked, not at Eliza, but around her. She was not suspected. She was assumed irrelevant. That assumption sealed their fate. The break came with Rose. Rose Bellamy had grown quieter over the weeks, withdrawing from both parents. Eliza noticed the change long before anyone else. One evening, Rose slipped Eliza a folded piece of paper. "Hide this," she whispered. Eliza unfolded it later, alone. It was a letter, raw, emotional, written to someone Rose had never been allowed to love. It spoke of loneliness, resentment, desperation. Eliza returned it the next morning, but not to Rose. Lydia found it on her dressing table. Her hands trembled as she read. That night Lydia confronted Edmund, the letter clutched like a weapon. "She is miserable," Lydia cried, "because you rule this house with silence and fear." Edmund's face hardened. "She shames us." "She is a child," Lydia snapped. Edmund struck the table. "Enough!" Rose heard the shouting. She ran. By dawn she was gone. No note, no trace. Panic replaced anger. Caleb organized searches. Edmund rode out himself. Lydia collapsed in grief. Whispers spread quickly. "They drove her away. They broke her. They deserve it." Eliza watched from the quarters, her face unreadable. 3 days later, Rose was found miles away, alive, but ruined in reputation. The scandal spread faster than the relief. Bellamy Plantation became a name people avoided. Edmund blamed Lydia. Lydia blamed Edmund. Caleb resigned and took work elsewhere, taking his version of events with him. Within months, Bellamy Plantation was sold at a loss. As Eliza was led away once more, Lydia watched from the porch, hollow-eyed. "Was it you?" Lydia whispered, not daring to raise her voice. Eliza met her gaze. "I never spoke a lie," she said quietly. "That was the cruelest truth of all. The third house. The third family did not underestimate Eliza. They feared her. That fear made them reckless." Grayson Manor stood near the edge of pine country, owned by Silas Grayson, a man whose wealth came from trade rather than land. He was sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, and deeply paranoid. When Eliza arrived, Silas summoned his household immediately. "This girl brings trouble," he announced. "You will speak to her only when necessary. You will watch her." Eliza listened. Fear, she knew, always announced itself loudly. Silas Grayson's wife, Eleanor, was nothing like Margaret or Lydia. She was observant, calculating, and suspicious of everyone, including her husband. "If she is dangerous," Eleanor said later, "it is because people let her be." Silas snorted. "She's a slave." Eleanor did not respond. Eliza was placed under constant watch, given heavy labor, denied privacy. But fear sharpened her resolve. Silas watched her too closely, questioned her too often, changed stories mid-sentence to see if she noticed. She noticed everything. Eleanor, meanwhile, began asking questions of her own. "What did you hear?" she asked servants after arguments. "Who said what?" Eliza became the silent center of a house vibrating with suspicion. Silas Grayson had secrets, not sins of passion or cruelty, but of money. Eliza learned the rhythms of his trade, when shipments arrived, when documents were signed, when accounts were altered quietly at night. She said nothing, until Eleanor began noticing discrepancies. "This ledger does not match last month's," Eleanor said one evening. Silas stiffened. "You wouldn't understand trade." "I understand numbers," Eleanor replied coldly. Their marriage cracked. Silas began accusing servants of theft. Punishments escalated. Fear spread like rot. Eliza watched Eleanor watch Silas. One night, Eleanor asked her quietly, "You listen, don't you?" Eliza lowered her eyes. "I hear what is said." "Then tell me," Eleanor whispered. "Am I being lied to?" Eliza paused. She could lie. She did not. "I have heard things that do not match," she said carefully. That was all. Eleanor confronted Silas the next day. Silas denied everything. She produced records. He accused her of conspiring with servants. The house erupted. Silas locked Eleanor out of his study. Eleanor began keeping her own documents. Servants were questioned, threatened, bribed. Eliza said nothing more. She did not need to. The final collapse came suddenly. Silas Grayson was arrested. Charges of fraud, brought by a rival trader who had heard whispers, who had followed rumors that began not with Eliza's words, but with the fear that surrounded her presence. Grayson Manor was seized pending investigation. Eleanor left without looking back. The servants scattered. Eliza was sold again, this time cheaply, urgently. As the trader led her away, he muttered, "You're cursed." Eliza looked at him calmly. "No," she said, "I am remembered." What the world began to say. By now Georgia whispered her story openly. 3 houses, nothing left standing. They say she never strikes. They say she only listens. Planters refused to buy her, until curiosity outweighed caution. Some believed they could control her. Some believed the stories exaggerated. Some believed fear itself was the real enemy. They were all wrong, because by the time Eliza reached the 4th house, she no longer needed to learn how families broke. She already knew, and the next family would not simply fall. They would fight. By the time Eliza reached the 4th county line, she had stopped being a person in the minds of others. She was a story now. Stories travel faster than wagons. They outrun truth, shed details, sharpen edges. By the time her name passed from mouth to mouth, it no longer belonged to her. It had become something larger, darker, more useful to fear than fact. They say she ruins houses. They say she don't touch nobody, but everybody bleeds. They say if she looks at you long enough, your family turns on itself. Some said she was cursed. Others said she was blessed by a cruel kind of justice. Most did not care which, as long as the story explained what they were too afraid to examine in themselves. Eliza heard none of this directly, but she felt it, in the way traders avoided her eyes, in the way overseers kept their distance, in the way new owners spoke about her as if she were not standing there. She's quiet, they said, too quiet, and always too much. The 4th destination was not yet revealed to her. The trader had not spoken its name, only muttering that the buyer had paid well despite the warnings. "Man thinks himself clever," the trader scoffed. "Says he don't believe in ghosts." Eliza stared out at the road, the trees blurring together in shades of green and brown. Ghosts, she knew, were simply memories that refused to stay buried. On the 3rd night of travel, the trader made camp near a shallow creek. He drank more than usual, his nerves worn thin by long days and longer rumors. "You ever wonder why people say things about you?" he asked suddenly, poking at the fire. Eliza did not answer. He laughed harshly. "They say you're the devil in a dress, that you ruin men without lifting a finger." The fire crackled. "I sell what I'm told to sell," he continued. "But you make folks uneasy." Eliza finally spoke. "Fear needs a shape." The trader frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," she said calmly, "people give fear a name so they don't have to face it." The trader stared at her for a long moment, then looked away. That night, Eliza dreamed. The dream did not come gently. It never did. She was younger in it, small, thin, her hands already scarred from work too heavy for her age. The smell of salt hung thick in the air. Wood creaked beneath her bare feet. A ship, the memory dragged her under without mercy. She remembered her mother's hand squeezing hers too tightly, remembered the way her mother whispered her name again and again, as if repetition might protect it. "Eliza, Eliza, Eliza." She remembered the man who tore them apart, not violently, not cruelly, casually, as if separating a child from her mother required no more thought than separating grain from chaff. She remembered screaming until her voice broke, and then learning silence. Eliza woke before dawn, her chest tight, breath shallow. The trader slept nearby, unaware. She sat up slowly, wrapping her arms around herself, not for comfort, but to remind herself she was still whole. People believed monsters were born in moments of rage or madness. They were wrong. Monsters were shaped over years of being unseen, unheard, and unprotected. Long before Hawthorne Ridge, long before Bellamy Plantation, long before her name learned how to travel, there had been another H. Aus, her first It had been a small plantation near the Carolina coast, nothing grand, no white columns, no pretense of refinement, just land, labor, and cruelty stripped of ceremony. She had been born there, unnamed for weeks, because her mother feared naming her would make her easier to take away. Her mother had been gentle once. Eliza remembered that faintly, like recalling warmth after a long winter. Gentle hands, quiet songs, stories whispered at night about rivers that carried people home. Her father had been sold when Eliza was still small. She remembered only his voice, low and steady, telling her to listen more than she spoke. "Listening keeps you alive," he had said. She took that lesson into her bones. When her mother was beaten for refusing a demand, Eliza learned another lesson: pain taught faster than kindness ever could. When her mother disappeared, sold, punished, erased, Eliza learned the final lesson: love was a weakness others could use against you. So she buried it. Her first sale had been brutal. She had cried then. She had begged. She had learned quickly that begging only fed cruelty. By the second sale she was quiet, by the third observant, by the fourth dangerous, not because she sought revenge blindly, but because she began to see patterns: men who demanded obedience but feared losing control, women trapped in roles they enforced on others to survive, children raised in houses where affection was currency, not comfort. Every household carried the same fault lines. All Eliza did was notice them. At Grayson Manor, when Eleanor Grayson had asked her if she was being lied to, Eliza had felt something twist inside her, not pity, not sympathy, recognition. She had seen that look before. In her mother's eyes, in Lydia Bellamy's silence, in Margaret Hawthorne's tightening jaw, women who sensed the truth but had been taught never to trust it. Eliza did not invent their fears. She confirmed them. By the time the trader woke, Eliza's face had returned to calm stillness. "You dream bad?" he asked gruffly. "No," she replied. That was a lie, but some truths were not meant to be shared. The fourth house awaited, and unlike the others, this one already knew exactly who she was supposed to be. Blackwood Estate sat deep inland, surrounded by thick forest that swallowed sound and light alike. The house itself was old, older than the others Eliza had known. Its walls were darkened by time, its windows narrow and watchful. Its owner, Jonah Blackwood, met her personally. He was not tall, not loud, not cruel in the obvious ways. He smiled too easily. "I've heard about you," he said pleasantly. Eliza lowered her gaze. "Yes, sir." "They say you break families," Jonah continued. "I find that fascinating." Fear brushed against Eliza's spine, not sharp, but cold. Jonah studied her like a puzzle. "Don't worry. I don't fear you." That, she knew, was dangerous. Blackwood Estate was already a battleground. Jonah Blackwood ruled through manipulation rather than force. He pitted people against each other openly, delighted in secrets, rewarded betrayal. His wife, Miriam, had learned to survive by becoming unreadable. His grown sons watched each other more closely than any servant. This was not a house with cracks. It was a house built on them, and Jonah Blackwood believed that made him immune. "You won't find weakness here," he told Eliza one evening, watching her closely. "I know all my people's faults." Eliza thought of her father's words. "Listening keeps you alive." She said nothing. That night, alone in her quarters, Eliza finally allowed herself a moment of honesty. She was tired, not of labor, not of punishment, but of being a mirror. Every house saw itself reflected in her silence, and hated what it saw. She had not planned to become feared. She had not plotted the fall of families as some grand design. She had simply stopped protecting the lies that held them together. N.D. lies, once exposed to air, rotted quickly. The legend of Eliza said she seduced and destroyed families. The truth was quieter. She learned, she listened, she survived. And when survival required letting houses burn under the weight of their own sins, she did not step into the flames to save them. She stepped aside. Jonah Blackwood watched her from the shadows of his study, a smile curling at his lips. "A monster," he murmured. "Or a tool." He believed he could use her. He believed he understood her. That belief would be his greatest mistake, because Eliza was no longer reacting to houses. She was choosing, and the fourth family would not simply collapse quietly. They would fight, and in that fight the monster they feared would finally look back at them and decide whether to finish what fear had begun. Jonah Blackwood did not believe in accidents. He believed in leverage. From the moment Eliza crossed the threshold of Blackwood Estate, he treated her not as property nor as threat, but as a variable, something to be tested, measured, and, if possible, controlled. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. He simply believed that stories were tools, and like any tool, they worked best in the right hands. The house itself seemed to agree with him. Blackwood Estate was a place built for observation. Corridors bent unexpectedly. Staircases allowed one to hear voices before being seen. Doors closed softly, never quite sealing sound. The windows were narrow, the walls thick. Privacy was a myth. Jonah Blackwood had long since outlawed. Eliza felt it the first night, not the fear, she had learned to live with that, but the pressure, the sense of being weighed, evaluated, and anticipated. It was new. At Hawthorne Ridge and Bellamy Plantation, the danger had come from denial. At Grayson Manor, it had come from paranoia. Here it came from intent. Jonah Blackwood summoned his household the morning after Eliza's arrival. His wife, Miriam, stood beside him, her hands folded neatly, her face serene in a way that suggested long practice. Their elder son, Caleb Blackwood, leaned against the wall with casual arrogance, while the younger Elias hovered near the doorway, eyes darting, alert. "You've heard of her," Jonah said pleasantly, gesturing toward Eliza as though introducing a guest. "I won't insult you by pretending otherwise." Caleb smirked. "The housebreaker." Miriam said nothing. Jonah continued. "I've bought her for a reason. She is observant, quiet, and surrounded by nonsense. I want to see what happens when nonsense meets structure." His gaze lingered on Eliza. "You will work where I can see you. You will speak when spoken to. And you will remember this. Nothing happens in this house without my knowing." "Yes, sir," Eliza said. Her voice was steady. Jonah smiled. The trap did not spring immediately. Jonah was patient. He placed Eliza deliberately, in the spaces where conversations overlapped, the study where accounts were discussed, the dining room where grudges surfaced under the guise of civility, the sitting room where Miriam stitched quietly and listened. He wanted to see what she would do. She did very little. That was what unsettled him. Miriam Blackwood watched Eliza with a different eye. Miriam had learned survival early. Jonah had not been cruel to her in the ways men often were. Instead, he had been precise. Every kindness came with an expectation, every silence with a consequence. Over time, Miriam had learned the value of appearing harmless. She recognized the same skill in Eliza. One afternoon, as Eliza folded linens near the window, Miriam spoke softly. "They say you ruin houses." Eliza did not look up. "People say many things. Do you enjoy it?" Miriam asked. Eliza paused. "Enjoyment is a luxury." Miriam studied her face. "And survival?" Eliza met her gaze briefly. "That is a necessity." Something unspoken passed between them. Not trust, not alliance. Recognition. Jonah escalated. He began feeding the house conflicting information, small lies, carefully placed. To Caleb he hinted that Elias questioned his authority. To Elias he suggested Caleb resented him. To Miriam he implied the sons were hiding something from both parents. Then he watched. Eliza noticed the pattern immediately. This was not a house unraveling by accident. This was a house being wound tighter. Caleb confronted Elias one evening in the yard. "You've been talking to father," Caleb said. Elias stiffened. "So have you," Caleb scoffed. "About me?" "About the business," Elias replied. Caleb stepped closer. "Don't lie to me." Eliza stood nearby, sorting tools, eyes lowered. "Did father tell you I was careless?" Caleb pressed. Elias hesitated. That hesitation was enough. The argument ended without resolution, but the damage was done. Jonah watched from the porch, satisfied. Then he looked at Eliza. She had not spoken. That annoyed him. The next move was bolder. Jonah summoned Eliza alone to his study. He gestured for her to stand before his desk. "You're clever," he said. "I respect that." Eliza said nothing. "I know the stories," Jonah continued. "I know what people fear about you. I also know fear can be useful." He leaned forward. "I want you to listen, and when you hear something interesting, something dangerous, you will bring it to me." Eliza raised her eyes. "And if I do not?" Jonah smiled thinly. "Then you will be returned to the road, and roads are unkind to people like you." Eliza considered him carefully. "Yes, sir," she said. It was not agreement. It was acknowledgement. Jonah believed the trap was set. What he did not understand was that Eliza had already walked into traps more elaborate than his, and learned how to live inside them. She did listen. She always had. But she did not report. Instead, she allowed Jonah's lies to echo unchecked. Caleb grew more aggressive. Elias grew more secretive. Miriam grew quieter. The house tightened like a clenched fist. The first open rupture came when Jonah accused Miriam of withholding information. "You know more than you say," he told her at dinner. Miriam set her fork down slowly. "I know what you choose to tell me." Jonah's eyes hardened, careful. Caleb watched amused. Elias watched alarmed. Eliza poured wine, her hands steady. "You see," Jonah said to his sons, "this is what secrecy does." Miriam's voice was calm, or manipulation. The word struck like a slap. Silence followed. Jonah rose. "Enough." But something had shifted. Miriam no longer looked afraid. She looked resolved. That night Miriam found Eliza in the laundry room. "You hear things," Miriam said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Does my husband plan to destroy this family?" Eliza paused. Here it was. The moment Jonah believed he controlled, Eliza chose her words carefully. "I believe your husband believes he is in control." Miriam nodded slowly. "And you?" "I believe control requires truth," Eliza replied, "and truth does not like cages." Miriam exhaled shakily. "Thank you." For the first time, Eliza saw something like gratitude. Jonah realized too late that Miriam had slipped beyond his reach. He doubled down. He accused Elias publicly of disloyalty. He threatened Caleb's position in the business. He tightened discipline across the estate. Fear surged, but fear, when overused, turned inward. Caleb began keeping records of his own. Elias started meeting contacts without permission. Servants whispered openly. Eliza moved through it all like a ghost. The confrontation came on a cold evening, the air sharp with approaching rain. Jonah summoned his family to the study. "This ends tonight," he declared. "No more secrets." Caleb laughed bitterly. "You mean no more of ours?" Elias stood rigid. "You taught us to hide." Miriam spoke last. "You taught us not to trust." Jonah's face flushed. "Ungrateful, all of you." He turned, suddenly toward Eliza. "And you, what have you heard?" The room went still, every eye fixed on her. This was the moment Jonah had waited for. Eliza stepped forward slowly. "I have heard," she said. "A man who believes control is the same as strength." Jonah smiled. "And?" "I have heard sons taught to compete instead of protect," she continued, "and a wife taught to survive instead of speak." Jonah's smile faded. "I have heard fear masquerading as order," Eliza finished quietly, "and lies asking to be believed." Jonah slammed his hand on the desk. I dare speak what already exists," Eliza said. The house seemed to breathe. Caleb stared at his father. Elias's hands shook. Miriam stood very still. Jonah realized then that the trap had closed on him. The fallout was immediate and violent, not in blood, but in consequence. Caleb stormed out, vowing to take his share and leave. Elias followed, accusing Jonah of turning them against each other. Miriam did not move. When Jonah looked at her, pleading now, she shook her head. "I see you," she said simply. Jonah turned to Eliza, rage burning. "You did this." Eliza met his gaze. "No, sir, I only stopped holding the mirror." By dawn, Blackwood Estate was in chaos. Legal disputes loomed. Business partners withdrew. Servants fled. Jonah sat alone in his study, staring at ledgers that no longer meant anything. Eliza was sold within the week, but the damage could not be undone. Blackwood Estate did not collapse quietly. It screamed. As the wagon carried Eliza away, she did not feel triumph, only exhaustion. She had not sought to destroy the fourth family. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that facing truth might save them. Instead, they had fought it and lost. Behind her, Blackwood Estate receded into the trees, a monument to a man who believed fear was mastery. Ahead lay silence, and the weight of a legend now complete. History rarely records the quiet endings. It remembers battles, proclamations, executions, moments loud enough to echo. But some lives conclude not with spectacle, but with a slow settling, like dust after a storm. Eliza's ending was like that. No crowd gathered, no final speech was made, and yet, long after her footsteps vanished from the red roads of Georgia, people continued to speak her name in lowered voices, as though saying it too loudly might invite something back. The wagon that carried her from Blackwood Estate rolled at dawn. Frost clung to the grass, and the air cut sharp against the skin. The trader driving this time was young, unfamiliar with the full weight of the stories. He knew enough to keep his distance, enough to avoid conversation. Eliza did not mind. Silence had become a companion she trusted. As the estate disappeared behind the trees, Eliza felt something she had not allowed herself in years. A loosening. Not relief, not peace, simply the absence of tension that had wrapped her spine like wire. The fourth house had fought back, harder than the others, and in doing so it had exposed something even Jonah Blackwood could not manipulate. Truth, once spoken plainly, refused to crawl back into cages. The trader cleared his throat. "They don't want you in Georgia anymore," he said without looking at her. "Too much talk." Eliza nodded. She had expected that. "Where will you send me?" she asked. "South," he replied. "Border country, new owners, folks who haven't heard the stories yet." Eliza did not correct him. Stories always arrived first. They traveled for days through thinning plantations and thickening forest. At night, Eliza watched the stars and thought of her mother's whispered tales, of rivers that remembered names, of land that held footprints long after bodies moved on. She wondered, not for the first time, whether places remembered her. She wondered whether Hawthorne Ridge still stood silent at dusk, its windows dark and hollow, whether Bellamy Plantation's fields lay untended, whether Gray's, on Manor's ledgers, rotted in some forgotten office, whether Blackwood Estate echoed with footsteps that no longer belonged to anyone. She wondered whether the houses felt emptier without her. The trader sold her quietly at a crossroads market far from churches and town squares. No inspection, no theatrics. The buyer was a middle-aged man with careful eyes and a wife who did not speak. They asked few questions. As Eliza stepped from one ownership to another, something subtle changed. For the first time she was not afraid. Not because danger was gone, but because fear no longer ruled her choices. The new plantation was smaller than the others, modest. Its owner, Samuel Reeves, was practical, suspicious of drama, uninterested in rumor. He assigned Eliza to field work at first, keeping her far from the house. "Work," he told her. "That's all I want." "Yes, sir," Eliza replied, and she worked. The days blurred into one another, sunrise to sundown, cotton-scraping skin, sweat-stinging eyes. It was honest labor in a way the houses had never been. No secrets whispered in hallways, no eyes watching from behind doors. At night she slept deeply for the first time in years. The plantation did not break, and Eliza did not try to test it. Weeks passed. Then months. Rumors, however, have long memories. A neighboring overseer mentioned her name in passing. Samuel Reeves frowned and asked questions. He was told fragments, exaggerations, distortions, half-truths sharpened by fear. "She ruined families. She turned sons against fathers. She's dangerous." Samuel Reeves watched Eliza more closely after that, but he did not act. Fear had taught him nothing useful in life. It was Samuel's wife, Anne, who noticed Eliza first. Anne Reeves had been quiet all her life, not weak, just accustomed to being unheard. She saw in Eliza a stillness that mirrored her own. One evening, Anne asked her to help with household tasks. Eliza entered the house again, not as a shadow, not as a threat, but as a worker. The walls did not close in. Anne asked no questions about the past. She spoke of weather, of crops, of small hopes never voiced aloud. Eliza listened. She always listened, but something in her listening had changed. She no longer listened for fractures, she listened for life. The legend did not die easily. Travelers spoke of Eliza as if she were already gone. Children repeated stories their parents swore they did not believe. Planters warned each other with a half-laugh and a shiver. "Watch your house," they said, "or Eliza will." The name detached from the woman. It became a symbol. Fear prefers symbols. They are easier to fight than truths. Years passed. Eliza aged quietly. Lines appeared at the corners of her eyes. Strength left her shoulders slowly, like a tide retreating. She was sold once more, then again, but always to smaller places, farther from centers of power. The legend followed, but thinner now, stretched by distance and time. She never broke another family. Not because she could not, but because she no longer needed to. In her later years, Eliza worked in a small household where children laughed freely and arguments ended in silence rather than violence. It was not kindness that surprised her, it was repair. When cracks appeared, people spoke instead of hiding. One evening, the mistress of the house asked her, "You've seen many places. What breaks a home?" Eliza thought carefully before answering. "Fear," she said, "and silence that protects it." The woman nodded as though this confirmed something she had always suspected. When Eliza grew ill, no one chained her to work, no one accused her of weakness. She was allowed to rest in the shade, to breathe slowly, to remember. She remembered her mother's voice most clearly then, not the screams, not the loss, the songs. She died without ceremony on a warm afternoon, cicadas buzzing loud enough to drown thought. No stone marked her grave, no record bore her name. She was buried beneath a tree whose roots twisted deep into the earth, and yet she did not disappear. Long after her death, stories persisted. Some said she had been evil, some said she had been justice, some said she had been nothing more than a mirror men were afraid to look into. The truth, as always, was quieter. Eliza did not seduce and destroy families, she revealed them. She stepped into houses already leaning toward collapse and refused to hold them upright with lies. She listened when others demanded silence. She survived when survival required clarity rather than obedience, and in a world built on fear, that was unforgivable. Plantations changed, laws shifted, chains broke, slowly, painfully, unevenly. Houses that once ruled entire counties crumbled into dust and memory, but in certain parts of Georgia, old men still warned young ones. Watch what you hide. Houses don't fall because of storms alone. Sometimes they fall because someone finally listens. They did not always say her name. They did not need to. Eliza's legend endured not because she was feared, but because she was understood too late. And history, when it fails to protect the quiet, often turns them into monsters to excuse its own cruelty. That is how her story ended, not with vengeance, not with forgiveness, but with a truth that refused to die. Some lives break the world not by striking it, but by refusing to lie for it.